Now let me start with a phrase. It doesn't matter, capital or small letters works fine. Now let me start with a phrase most commonly used by our American friends. United we stand and divided we fall. This is a phrase that for me sums up what TTIP is all about. I'm saying this because I truly believe that TTIP is not only economy and numbers. It's much more than that. The European Union had a very turbulent year this past 12 months. Political landscape throughout the EU reshuffled. We got the new composition of the Parliament, of the Commission, and also we got the new President of the European Council. It seems as though that the topics that had interested European citizens the most this past year were the Greek crisis, security, immigration, and of course TTIP. Well, today we will focus on TTIP. So that's on transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which is one of the most important topics of this legislative mandate. TTIP is all the more important now, also because of the recent political changes in the EU and the growing influence by Putin's Russia. Today we will try to look into the TTIP. What does it actually mean for Europe? What does it mean for the US? How will it influence our daily lives, European economy, jobs, growth? And how important is the geopolitical component of TTIP? Now, TTIP is a proposed free trade agreement between the European Union and the United States. On 14th of June 2013, member states gave the European Commission the green light to start trade and investment talks with the United States. When negotiations are completed, this EU-US agreement would be the biggest bilateral trade deal ever negotiated, and it could add up around 0.5% to the EU's annual economic output. Already the 10th negotiating round concluded in Brussels on 17th of July. Talks covered a broad range of subjects across all three pillars of TTIP. And it seems that there is a growing optimism for the road ahead with the latest Lange report adopted in the European Parliament, and also on the other side of the Atlantic, the congressional passing of the Trade Promotion Authority, also known as the Fast Track Procedure. Although a large majority of independent expert analysis predicted higher employment and GDP growth for all EU states if TTIP is agreed upon, there are, on the other hand, a couple of TTIP myths created, which are being furiously promoted by the dominant, at least Slovenian media. There are questions on transparency, lowering of European standards, ISDS, and so on and so forth. And that is why I couldn't be happier to have in our midst today Dr. Stefan Gehrold, Director of Konrad Adenauer Inštitut's European Office, who will shine some light on TTIP and the issues surrounding the agreement. And with this, and without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to you, Dr. Gehrold.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you very much, dear Andrea, dear Milan, dear Peter, dear Janai, dear guests, friends of SDS and friends of the Pučnika Institute. I'm very happy that I'm back here in Ljubljana. When I say I'm back, in between 2000 and 2004, Milan mentioned it, I was the head of office of our Zagreb branch, and in that capacity I was also responsible for our work in Slovenia. So I went back, from that time, Milan, we met, and we've known each other ever since, been in contact ever since. It's been and I must say, when I arrived yesterday afternoon for the first time to Ljubljana after 8 years, it was quite. It has really changed, and I must say for the better. It looks nicer. It looked nice at the time, but it looks even nicer right now. The only problem that I had when I wanted to go to my usual hotel, Slon, is that I never got to it because the road was blocked. And then I went all around the block and tried, and then there was a sign saying road or street closed apart from guests of the Sloan Hotel. So I wanted to bear right, But then I couldn't get in physically, so I went all around to the hotel in Lyon and rang the guys at the reception, and then they eventually opened the barrier for me. So eventually my car got somewhere, and I got to the hotel slow. But Peter told me today that there's about some 1,000 buses to be expected daily to go through that street. Sounds a little much for a pedestrian zone, but that's not for me to judge. So anyway. So I'm happy that I'm back, and unfortunately I'm unhappy that I cannot do this in Slovenian, because at the time I learned Croatian, but I didn't learn Slovene, and I do accept any criticism as to my language, my lingual deficits. Interestingly enough. You pointed out here. Hang on. You pointed out here that this was an event also organized by the Martin Center. Martin Center being the umbrella organization, our European umbrella organization, also of Konrad Adenauer Foundation. And the Martin Center has established a working group on TTIP before the summer break. And I'm also a member of this group, but it shows us how important our political party and our political scene does take this issue, and things that we will have to make an argument in favor of this agreement that we deem beneficial for everybody. Also, it's very remarkable that you are all here because of that nice weather and that nice city, and you could be sitting out there having a nice beer or a nice coffee in one of the nice street bars of this town, but you're here to talk about TTIP. That really tells us something. It tells us even more, tells me even more something that my son is here, who's completely bored with the issue, any political issue at the age of 15 years, and I'd be possibly the same at his age, and that he's here with me, but he took the burden upon him, and he's done all the long way back from northern Germany, from Cologne in that case, to Zagreb and then Ljubljana. So thank you very much, Franz Josef, for being here. And under his critical eyes, I tried to repeat my speech this afternoon when we were in a hotel, and his English is pretty good because he used to attend American school, so he gave me a couple of very good clues that really improved my speech considerably. I would like to... So here we go. I would like to start off with a very unofficial and very informal poll, because I'm always doing this, and I'm getting quite different answers to this. And if you would just raise your hand, and I try to do that percentage-wise, and to answer a couple of questions that I would like to fire at you before you ask me questions. So what's your opinion on TTIP? I've got a couple of concrete questions. So the first question would be, chlorine sanitized chicken presents a genuine health problem. Who would agree to that? Who'd be neutral? Who'd be against? Who would say yes? I think this is a genuine problem. So we got about, let's say, about 8%, 10% maybe. Okay. Who would say no? Okay, that's even less. I put 5. Who's neutral? And the rest is neutral. The 85%. Is that, or shall I ask again? I put 85%, if you say so. Second question. I do not trust the US or view them with skepticism. Who would agree to that question? Nobody? 0%. That was quite a different picture, I must say, when I was at German universities. Who would say no? This is completely wrong. So I would get, let's say, roughly 40, 35%. I take it the rest is neutral? Pretty much neutral? Okay. Then we're here at 65. Third question. TTIP is much more beneficial for the US than for Europe, of course. Who would agree to that statement?
For Europe too.
No, it's just first, TTIP is much more beneficial for the US. Who would agree to that statement? Who would say that this is not correct? And who'd be neutral? Who would say that this is correct? Nobody? Okay, 0. Who would say that this statement is not correct? So I'll take 60. So I take it 40% neutral. That's about it. Okay. You've got to vote as well. I haven't seen you vote in yet. Fourth, the US will dominate us soon. It's interesting because I get really very interesting answers to that very unofficial poll when I'm asking those questions and touring through Germany. Who would say that the US will dominate us soon? Who would agree to that statement? No one. Okay, 0. Who would say this statement is wrong? That is considerable. I would say 85 and 15 neutral. Okay. Now, last question here. With how many states does the EU have a trade agreement or is in the process of negotiation? Well, there's 3 possibilities. First would be under 20, next be in between 20, 50, and the third possibility be over 50. Who'd say up to 20, in between 0 and 20? No one? Well, just a guess. I mean, many people just don't know it, and they just guess. So most of the people, in fact, don't know it. So I put 0. Who would say that the European Union has trade agreements or is in process of negotiation between 20 to 50 states? So that's roughly 50%. And over 50, that'd be the rest of it. Well, yeah, okay, that's about it, so 50%. Okay, I will come back to that later, and I'm sort of collecting that data, and then see whether different audiences answer in a different way to those questions. And indeed, it is very interesting that you really get different answers to those questions with regard to the intellectual level of people I'm talking to, with regard of age, and of course with the regard of political affiliation, if there is any. But if there is a broader public as an audience, there's no political affiliation in particular. So that cannot be determined in those cases. Then a structure of what I'm going to do with you tonight. First of all, what are the regional free trade agreements worldwide? Are there any? Secondly, the economic dimension of TTIP. TTIP, why? A couple of arguments in favor. And then the fourth chapter would be myths and facts. Now that is a map of the free trade agreements. Coming back to my question I had before, the European Union has either concluded or is in process of negotiations. You can see the red countries are those with which the European Union has already concluded a free trade agreement. The yellow countries are the EEA countries, European Economic Area, with which there is a free trade agreement in place. Of course, European Union, those are the green countries. Internal market is a free trade agreement, much more, but it of course contains a free trade agreement. And the dark green countries are those countries with which the European Union is currently negotiating a free trade agreement. And as those orange countries, with those countries, the European Union is considering to negotiate a free trade agreement. And you can see that this is more than 50 countries worldwide with which the European Union indeed is a process of negotiation that has already concluded. Interestingly enough, in the current discussion, many things are not being mentioned. The mere fact that there is free trade agreements in place with countries like Madagascar, Egypt, Mexico, or Algeria. So that is a very interesting fact. My argument would always be that having a free trade agreement is a thing that is completely normal, and that the European Union and the member countries have been doing for many, many years and many, many decades. And of course would induce the question why a free trade agreement with the US raises such concerns, raises such an outbreak of public uproar. My opinion is, or my judgment, that there is much more behind that than the question of whether we should organize free trade with the US or not. Now, of course, TTIP, as I mentioned, is not the first and only treaty of this scale that the EU or the US, for that matter, have negotiated so far. And here are a couple of facts regarding NAFTA and the EU internal market. You can see that those are estimates of the European Commission. You can see that the European Commission estimated in 2003 that the internal market yielded a GDP gain of 2.3% within the 20-year period from 1992 to 2012. The intra-EU trade increased from 12% of the annual GDP of the EU member countries to 22%, so by 10%, and that in those 20 years. And the Commission estimates as well that the internal market-induced job growth in that period amounted up to 1.3%, which might sound neglectable. In fact, it isn't when you look at the absolute figures. Now, for NAFTA, what are the benefits that have been generated by the NAFTA agreement? The US trade with the NAFTA agreement, including Canada, Mexico, and the US, has more than tripled in that period, in between 1993 and 2012, and just passed the $1 trillion mark. It is very difficult to estimate the direct effects of the NAFTA agreement, but the US ITC, the US Trade Commission, nevertheless tried to produce an estimate each year. And in 2003, it was calculated, for example, that in case of a full implementation, profound liberalization of the free trade agreement, it could lead up to a 0.5% growth in GDP in the US. That's here. From the Mexican point of view, the treaty was profitable as well and beneficial. Each year, an additional average of 1.2% of the per capita income was registered. The Mexican government, by implementing the treaty, abandoned many protectionist measures and adjusted their prices for tradable goods to the level of the other side of the border, which in consequence then reduced the deficit and thus created potential for, and that reduced the potential for crises. Second point, economic dimension of TTIP. What is TTIP? Now you can read that definition, or you can just listen to me. TTIP is a trade and investment agreement which has been negotiated or is being negotiated between the EU and the US since July 2013. Now, the objectives are creation of new jobs, as well as the stimulation of economic growth through the removal of trade obstacles, especially tariffs, and necessary double regulation, constraints for investment in as many economic sectors as possible. Now, the chief negotiator on the European side is the EU Commission, and the mandate for the negotiation was granted, as Peter had pointed out before, to the Commission in 2013 by the European Council. Now, a quote, I would like to quote out of this mandate. There will be no negotiations about fundamental law. This includes statutes about GMO, protection of life and human health, the health and well-being of animals, of the environment and consumers' interests, end of quote. And this quote already would answer a lot of criticism that's being brought up by those NGOs and those parties Europe-wide that are criticizing TTIP as a non-beneficial project and as a project that aims at lowering standards in many sectors. Now, what's the potential of TTIP? Now, the overall effect of TTIP results from three pillars. First of all, enormous size of the two national economies. Second, extensive company internal trade. This is 1/3 of the transatlantic trade approximately, and high level of intra-industry trade. The two national economies, the EU28 and the US economy, stand for more than 45% of the global GDP. The EU and the USA are already strongly integrated. Now, and this is very interesting, 50% of all US subsidiary companies are being, in foreign countries, are located in Europe. And 75% of all European subsidiary companies are located in the United States. Now, who are the most important trade partners? First of all, for the US and then for the EU. The trade between the EU and the US represents about 30% of the global trade volume. In 2012, goods and services worth 500 billion euros were traded over the Atlantic. The imports out of the US to the EU aggregate to the sum of 200 billion euros, and that equals 11.5% of all imports of the EU. On the other side, goods and services worth 300 billion euros were exported to the US, and this is 17.3% of all exports of the EU. Now, the United States are the most important trade partner for the EU, ahead of China, Russia, and Switzerland, as you can see. The same can be said about the US, vice versa, for which the EU is the most important trading partner, ahead of Canada and China. This came to me as a surprise, actually, that Canada was that strong, that important a partner for the US, even more important than China. Now, thirdly, why? A couple of arguments pro TTIP. TTIP and TTP, which is the Trans-Pacific trade partnership that is being negotiated right now between the US and a couple of Eastern Asian countries, excluding China, but for instance including South Korea and Japan, could serve as an example of successful trade policy and would give the WTO and its members the boost which brings them back on the right track. Now, we know that the WTO has been quite inefficient and inactive for the last couple of years, and TTIP could really be a tool to spark those WTO negotiations again. The American economist Richard Baldwin established the thesis in the 1990s, of an avalanche effect. Multinational corporations as a consequence of international trade negotiations and trade agreements. Multinational corporations desire a regulatory harmonization in order to framework their value chains in an efficient way. Once established, this pressure transmits to other most favored nation agreements and thus leads to the mentioned avalanche effect. So according to this theory, it has been proven empirically in many cases in the meantime, TTIP could be the model for a global liberalization and new economic impulses. For some concrete figures, the predicted rise, this is increase of per capita income, sources the IFO Institute, Munich-based. Basically, this study has been carried out by Professor Felbermayr. The predicted rise of per capita income in all EU countries in case of a profound liberalization is roughly 5%. Now what's the difference? This red column is just the abolition of tariffs. The blue column represents abolition of tariffs and harmonization of standards. So abolishment of all non-trade trade barriers as well. In case of the abandonment of tariffs, now the US in that case would, in case of a profound liberalization, profit up to 13.4%, of which its per capita income would increase. In case of the abolition of tariffs alone, that'd be 0.8% in the case of the US, 0.3% in the case of the European Union. Now, does that apply to the employment market as well? What are the number of jobs, again, according to the IFO Institute, that will be created? Again, blue column, profound liberalization, and red column, abolishment of tariffs alone. A profound liberalization, according to the IFO Institute, would be highly beneficial for the job market in comparison to the sole abolition of tariffs. In case of the EU, that would amount up to roughly 1.4, 1.35 million new jobs over the next 5 years. In case of the US, 1.1 million new jobs. The study shows that unemployment would decrease in Spain by 0.62%, in Greece and Portugal by 0.7%, and in Ireland by 0.84%, countries that are in particular struggling with the current crisis and are suffering from a high unemployment rate. Now, this is the chief negotiator of the EU, Ignacio García Bercero. There's widespread worry that only big corporations will profit from the TTIP. Now, this might be the case in the sole liberalization of tariffs, but if it comes to an agreement in the abolition of non-tariff trade barriers and trade obstacles, small and medium-sized enterprises, SME, will profit as well. Less non-tariff trade barriers measures means less administration, at less administrative costs for SMEs, and consequently lower barriers for market entry, which are pivotal for SMEs. Besides, bigger markets will open for those enterprises. Markets that had only been open for the big corporations so far because they had the means and the tools to appear on another market, in that case on the US market. My last chapter, myths and facts. First myth, TTIP leads to privatization of the energy and drinking water supply. The answer is no. Privatizations will always be and only be concluded by the respective governments, national governments, not through the free trade agreement. They're not subject of the negotiations. Further, there are restrictions within the WTO service treaty that address the market access for public services. In the EU, it is allowed to preserve monopolies of public services up to a local level. Now here, the discussion was sparked, or the debate was sparked, by a very particular fact. The fact that European producers were discriminated, or European competitors were discriminated on the U.S. market when they wanted to, when they asked for, when they applied for public tenders in the U.S. and that should be done away with. Now, the anti-TTIP front turned this into a drinking water supply issue, which is incorrect because that's just not subject to the TTIP negotiations. Myth number 2, TTIP undermines the high European standards for data protection and freedom of information. Answer is again, no. Data protection is being discussed in specialized forums alone, as the expert groups on data protection or the EU-US Safe Harbor Agreement. In the framework of TTIP, data protection questions are not being debated. Myth number 3, TTIP disadvantages developing countries and emerging countries. On the contrary, empirical evidence shows us that countries with low income in particular, so I'm talking particularly developing countries, low income and stronger coherence to the US and the EU, in particular ACP countries, can profit from the fact that their resources are needed. The economic scientists Draper, Lacey, and Ramkalawan show that in case of harmonization of standards between the EU and the US, 2 counter-rotating effects would be faced by the third-party countries. If standards toughen, third countries will have to face higher compliance costs in the TTIP countries and potentially stronger competition stronger competition. If a non-participant country can fulfill the standards of a participant country, which sells its products in other markets, it automatically qualifies to sell its products in another participating country, which would be beneficial. In other words, country that I've lived in, Senegal, fulfills those standards. That in that case, products that would be produced in Senegal would qualify, and other products that don't qualify from countries that had been competitive, where there are companies that had been competitors before, would not qualify, and that would, in other words, enable a Senegalese company to enter a market that had been closed before just because it wasn't competitive. This can be a huge step forward for companies that had and countries which national economies have been excluded for a long time just because they weren't competitive. So that this is a possibility to surpass other companies of maybe other countries like, say, Russia that have so far been more successful on the European market or the US market. Will TTIP worsen the European working standards that the TTIP, the anti-TTIP front claims are particularly high? No. Before the negotiations started, it was already clarified that working and social standards were non-negotiable, and that high levels must be preserved. The minimum wage, sustainable development, and standards for the environment, for example, are untouchable. Just a side remark here, the US had a minimum wage, not that I'm a particular friend of the minimum wage, I consider this foolish, but anyway, if you consider this progress, the US had a minimum wage at a time when Germany didn't have a minimum wage. So the question is always, does does harmonization of standards, if there were any, but they're not going to be, does that lead to lower standards so-called lower standards in Europe? TTIP, on the contrary, will create jobs and increase actual earnings without affecting working standards. A study of the International Labour Organization, which is deemed to be pretty neutral, comes to our prior conclusion. Trade boosts the number of exporting enterprises in a national economy, which will normally pay higher wages. So preferential trade treaties result in more and better paid jobs. That's the conclusion of the International Labour Organization. Myth number 5, and here you can see the nice Teutonic chicken being fed on this dark green, and you can already imagine how those poor chicken are going to be chlorine sanitized in the next few minutes, whilst they're having this happy life, which represents about 100% the life those chickens have in the big German breeding stables. TTIP should lead to mutual recognition of many standards, but it is beyond discussion that lower US standards, if there were any, will be accepted. Again, I would like to quote at this point the mandate that the Commission received by the European Council. There will not be negotiations about fundamental law. This includes laws about GMO, protection of life, and the health of human beings, the health and well-being of animals, the environment, and the interest of consumers. So the existing strict EU statutory provisions remain in place. The TTIP negotiations will not lead to changes in EU requirements for admission and mandatory identification of food, animal feed, and seeds which contain genetically modified organisms. And does chlorinated chicken at all? I would like to I don't know how important that discussion is in Slovenia, and in Germany it's the big story of the anti-TTIP front. Does chlorinated chicken finally pose a threat to health, as I pointed out here? Well, first of all, salad in Europe is being sanitized the very same way dead chicken in the US are being sanitized with chlorine. So are we all chlorine poisoned now because we eat salad? I think the answer is no. And secondly, there are interesting European studies of agricultural institutes indicating that chlorine sanitized chicken is much more healthy way to produce meat than medicating chicken as it is possible in the European Union. In fact, just when I toured through Germany last year, there was a professor, when I came up with that slide, who raised his hands, and he was a German professor in agriculture from the University of Göttingen, who had passed 6 years at the American university. And he said, it's the other way around. US production of food is much healthier than the European one. Again, I'm not an expert on it. I'm not a biologist. I'm not an expert on agriculture. But there's obviously different opinions on that question. If that guy says the US standards are higher than the European ones. I'm only quoting this gentleman. I'm not saying that this is the truth or not. What I'm saying is there's obviously different opinions on that question. So I just would like to skip those here. Myth number 6. TTIP is a classified contract. It's a classified contract. Classified agreement. I wanted to point out that most of the documents, and try it on internet, are available online. TTIP is not being negotiated. That's a myth behind closed doors. The latest status of each negotiation round is publicly available on the website of the EU, and I did it, it's possible. The members of the TTIP advisory group are introduced with photos and biography on the website. And after each round of negotiations, the results are being publicly discussed in the forum, dialogue with the civil society. Recently, about 700 representatives of unions, federations, NGOs, and organizations of consumer protection took part in this discussion. Very last point here is ISDS. Investor-state dispute settlement suspends due course of law favoring corporations. And that's the allegation. Multinational enterprises will profit from the dispute settlement mechanism, will be able to impeach states before international courts in case of governmental intervention. Our opponents, the anti-TTIP front, criticizes that this would create a parallel justice system. Again, I would say no. ISDS is an instrument of public international law which allows international investors to start a dispute resolution against a foreign government. They can sue for damages if new laws constrain the profits, a virtual disappropriation is at hand, or only foreseeable. These cases are not then being dealt with in ordinary courts, but by an international arbitration commission. It's important, I think, to point out that this is nothing new. Similar procedures are implemented today in over 3,000 agreements worldwide. Germany alone has signed over 130 of those agreements, i.g. with countries like China, Saudi Arabia, and Georgia. These agreements allow the states to regulate public interests and preventing investors' interests. Those are the BITs, bilateral investment treaties, that Germany, 134, that Germany has already signed on the protection of investment. Those are the countries with which Germany has signed those agreements already. Interestingly enough, not with the US or Canada, huge, or maybe the biggest trading partners outside the European Union. Overall, EU member states signed about 1,400 of those BITs. Now, what are the advantages of ISDS? And as a lawyer, I think here I am, contrary to other subjects and contrary to other issues, I maybe am a specialist. First of all, parallelism of the legal framework guarantees state neutrality. There are three provisions. By provision of a forum free of governmental courts, problems like the lack of impartiality and immunity can be avoided. Secondly, law enforcement without detours. In the past, an investor could only negotiate directly with the host country or sue it in a national court or ask for help in its home country through diplomatic channels. Often these options weren't crowned with success. Would states use systems like ISDS as their accepted instruments to enforce their investors' rights, there would neither be a need for a drawn-out or unsafe fallback to diplomatic protection, nor on the result of the discussion, nor a dependence on the result of the discussion of lawsuits between the home and the host country. The investor is now a legal body and entitled to directly sue, if directly affected, sue privately. Thirdly, speed of lawsuits. We all know, and I talked to a Slovenian journalist today who complained about the very long lawsuits that the Slovenes are experiencing, and I can tell you Slovenia definitely is not an exception there. There are lawsuits in Germany that are in court for about 10 years or longer. There are lawsuits in other European countries, EU countries, that are even longer. So I think speed is essential, in particular if you want to have security in your investment. Now the ISDS would not allow for the possibility of appeal. And that, of course, shortens the entire procedure and is very advantageous to the absolute legal security of the investor. In other words, he's more inclined to come up with an investment than he would be otherwise, and maybe he would do away with the investment entirely if that speed wouldn't be, and that legal security wouldn't be guaranteed. Fourthly, expertise of judges. Now, I hold German judges in high esteem. Some of those guys don't know what they're talking about. Mostly they do. But in particular they do when I won a case, and in particular vice versa when I lost a case. But anyway, it is obvious that we're talking about a highly specialized field here. And for a highly specialized field, for international investments, we need highly specialized personnel. And common courts usually don't have sufficient expertise for those highly technical questions of international investment law. And I know a couple of judges, friends of mine. If I would bring up a case to them, they would ring me up. If I would file a lawsuit to that extent, they would ring me up 3 hours later and ask me whether I went insane to annoy them with such a case that they don't know anything about. They will have to read about 6 months prior before even scheduling the first meeting. Now, unfortunately, looking through the US lenses, several EU member states still suffer from insufficient jurisdiction, which further justifies the concerns of the US side. Germany, here you can see this is the rule of law index. The blue column concerns the legislation. The red one concerns regulatory enforcement, so we're talking executive. And you can see that Germany, Canada, and the US are pretty much on the same level. Sources the World Justice Project when it comes to the rule of law index. Now, in other European Union member countries, you're not that fortunate. In Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria, the rule of law index is pretty low still in comparison to those three countries. So maybe a US company wouldn't have a problem with suing the German state in a German court, but they definitely asked themselves whether it was worthwhile going to a court in Bulgaria, where security in a lawsuit and impartial jurisdiction is maybe not completely unlikely, but less likely than in their home country or in Canada. So again, ISDS would add to the inclination of those corporations, of those companies that want to invest at all, and that's what we want to see. That's what free trade is about, to the benefit of everybody. Last but not least, TTIP is not going to reach. We shouldn't overburden this agreement with any expectations from our side. It's not going to reach a complete liberalization, but it will manage to create the necessary framework, which will be enforced by economic challenges in the long run. TTIP will, in our eyes, consequently introduce a new era of global liberalization that can produce a new impetus for Europe, and in particular for those European economies that are in a crisis. For the US, and the US need economic boost as well as for third countries. The harmonization of standards and of goods will not result in inferior products and laws, and the European states will not be deprived of their powers through a free trade agreement with the US. We are also certain that not only the West can benefit from this partnership, but as I showed, developing countries as well, and maybe the entire world, by standards that are being set by this agreement. And I think it's better that the two most important economic blocs in the world, the US and the EU, set the standards than other economic blocs in the world that might be more successful in a couple of years. So thank you very much now for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.